There are moments in your life that function like doors. Most of the time, you walk through them without noticing, the transition from one room to the next so seamless it registers as nothing more than continued movement. But some doors are heavy. They have a weight and a grain you can feel even before you touch them. You can stand before them for minutes, hours, years, knowing that on the other side, the air will be different, the light will fall at a new angle, and the person you are in this room will not be the exact same person you will be in the next. You know that crossing the threshold is a choice, and that the sound of the latch clicking shut behind you will be the most final sound you have ever heard. For me, that door was not a physical thing, but a collection of 6 words, spoken by my best friend on a Tuesday night in late October. The air in my apartment was warm, smelling of old books and the rain that had been misting against the windows all evening. We were sitting on opposite ends of my worn-out leather couch, a familiar continent of space between us, when he turned to me. The movie we were supposed to be watching was playing out, a meaningless ballet of light and sound, but his attention was entirely on me. He said, "I miss how close we used to be," and then he looked at me. It was not a casual glance. It was a look of such profound, undisguised longing that it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. He looked at me like he wanted it back, all of it, whatever that closeness had been. He looked at me like I was the only person in the world who could give it to him. And in that moment, standing before that heavy, silent door, I felt the terrifying, magnetic pull of the handle, the cold brass of a choice I had been avoiding for almost a decade. The choice to find out what he truly meant, and the risk that in opening that door, the room we had so carefully built together would collapse into dust around us. To understand the weight of those words, you have to understand the geography of our friendship. Julian and I met in college, 2 celestial bodies pulled into the same unlikely orbit. I was on the swim team, a creature of chlorine-scented solitude and the muffled, rhythmic silence of being underwater. My world was measured in lap times and the lonely pursuit of shaving off milliseconds. He was on the water polo team, a force of chaotic energy, all shouting and splashing in fierce, boisterous camaraderie. Our worlds should have merely brushed past each other in the shared aquatic center, but a scheduling fluke put us in the same advanced photography class, a quiet elective I had chosen for my major, and he had chosen to fulfill a fine arts credit he'd almost forgotten about. He was, to put it mildly, lost. He held the bulky DSLR camera like it was a strange, delicate animal he was afraid of startling. I, who had spent years learning the language of light and shadow, found myself, against all my introverted instincts, offering to help. Our first real conversation happened in the dim, chemical-smelling peace of the darkroom. The red safe light cast everything in a warm, secret glow, stripping away the harsh realities of the outside world and leaving only the essential shapes of things. He was struggling with a roll of film, his large, capable hands suddenly clumsy and uncertain. I remember the quiet focus of that moment, guiding his fingers to feed the film onto the developing reel, the slight brush of our skin in the close quarters. He smelled of campus laundry detergent and something uniquely his own, a clean, sharp scent like fresh-cut lumber and autumn air. He was a supernova of extroversion and easy confidence in the bright light of day. But here, in the quiet dark, he was different. He was attentive, he was thoughtful, and he listened with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. That was the beginning. We became an oddity on campus, the quiet swimmer and the loud water polo player, an inseparable pair. After graduation, we fell into a shared apartment downtown, a logical extension of a friendship that had become foundational to both of us. It was a space filled with my camera equipment and his endless collection of consulting textbooks and business magazines. It was a place of comfortable, unspoken routines. We learned the rhythms of each other's lives. I knew he took exactly 2 sugars in his morning coffee, that he hummed off-key when he was working on a difficult project, that he had a telltale furrow in his brow when a client was giving him trouble. He learned that I needed at least an hour of quiet in the morning before I could properly function, that I organized my books by color instead of author, and that the slightest shift in the afternoon light could send me scrambling for my camera, desperate to capture a fleeting moment of beauty. Our lives were intertwined, 2 vines growing up the same trellis, so closely woven that it was impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. There was an easy physicality to our friendship that, from the outside, might have looked like something more, but for us, it was simply the air we breathed. We were two athletes, accustomed to the casual, nonverbal communication of shared physical space. On the couch, watching a game, his leg would be pressed against mine. In the kitchen, navigating the small space to get to the refrigerator, a hand would land on the small of my back to steady himself. These were gestures devoid of any explicit meaning, as natural as breathing. They were punctuation marks in the long, rambling sentence of our life together. For him, I believe they were entirely platonic. For me, they were a slow, beautiful, and agonizing torture. Because somewhere in the quiet red light of that college darkroom, I had fallen in love with him. It was a quiet, secret thing, a seed I had nurtured in the most hidden corners of my heart. It was a love that asked for nothing. I was a photographer, an observer by nature. I was content to watch him live, to capture the unguarded moments of his life in the frame of my memory. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the determined set of his jaw when he was focused, the vulnerable slump of his shoulders when he was exhausted. I loved him with the patient, hopeless devotion of a scholar studying a masterpiece. I knew every line, every shadow, every nuance of him, and I was content to simply appreciate the art without ever needing to own it. To risk our friendship, the most stable and important structure in my life, for a feeling he almost certainly did not share, felt like a form of madness. So I built walls around that feeling, high and thick, and I learned to live peacefully within them, appreciating the view of him from a safe distance. He dated, of course. There were a series of women, but the most significant was Amelia. She was smart and funny and ambitious, a perfect match for the bright, public version of Julian. I liked her truly. I saw how she made him happy, and his happiness was, and always had been, paramount. When they were together, the easy physicality between Julian and me naturally receded. The casual touches became less frequent, the shared space on the couch a little wider. It was a subtle shift, a tide going out, and I accepted it as the natural order of things. This was the architecture of adult life. Friends, no matter how close, eventually build their own separate houses. I was happy for him, but a part of me, the secret, walled-in part, felt the slow, creeping chill of an encroaching winter. I watched him build a life with her, and I prepared myself for the day he would move out, for the day our shared world would finally, officially, be divided in two. I photographed their engagement party, my eye pressed to the viewfinder, creating a necessary barrier between myself and the reality of the scene. I framed shots of them laughing, of her hand with the new ring on his arm, and I focused on the f-stops and the shutter speed, turning my emotional chaos into technical precision. I was the observer, the documentarian of my own gentle heartbreak. And then, one Tuesday night in early spring, the architecture of his life crumbled. He showed up at our apartment door well after midnight. I had been in my studio space, a converted corner of the living room, editing photos from a recent shoot. The knock was hesitant, not his usual confident rap. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking not shattered, but hollowed out. His usually impeccable suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his eyes had a vacant, exhausted quality I had never seen before. He did not say anything for a long moment. He just stood on the threshold, a man who had lost his map. I stepped aside and let him in, the unspoken question hanging in the air between us. He walked to the center of the living room, our living room, and finally spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "She ended it," he said. "Amelia." "It's over." He sank onto the couch, the one we had picked out together 5 years earlier, and stared at the blank television screen. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat there, emptied. I didn't know what to do. I was not equipped for this. My love for him had always been a passive, observational thing. It did not know how to act, how to comfort. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the kitchen and made him a cup of tea, the chamomile blend I knew he liked when he was stressed. I set it down on the coffee table in front of him and sat on the arm of the chair opposite the couch, giving him space, waiting. He eventually picked up the mug, his hands wrapping around it as if for warmth, and he began to talk. He spoke for hours, not about the drama of the breakup, but about the slow, quiet erosion of their relationship, the hairline fractures that had finally splintered the foundation. He talked about feeling disconnected, about performing a version of himself he thought he was supposed to be. He was a consultant. His job was to analyze systems and find their breaking points. Now, he was applying that same ruthless analysis to his own life, and the findings were bleak. I just listened. I was a vessel for his confusion and his grief. I did not offer advice or platitudes. I just provided a quiet, stable presence, an anchor in his storm. In the early hours of the morning, when his words finally ran out, he looked over at me, his eyes clear for the first time that night. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "For this. For being here." He gestured vaguely at the room, at me, at the entire silent, supportive space I had created for him. He fell asleep on the couch a few minutes later, still in his work clothes, the half-empty mug of tea cooling on the table. I found a blanket in the hall closet and draped it over him, my movements slow and careful, as if he were made of glass. I stood there for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest in the pre-dawn light filtering through the window. A part of me, a terrible, selfish part, felt a flicker of something that was not entirely sympathy. It was a dark, hopeful thing, a seed that had been dormant for years, now stirring in the soil of his sorrow. And I hated myself for it. That night was the beginning of the shift. It was a subtle recalibration of our universe. Julian had always been my center of gravity, the sun my quiet planet orbited. But now, in his own darkness, he began to orbit me. He started spending more time at home, canceling plans with mutual friends to instead opt for quiet nights in. Our apartment, which had started to feel like a temporary way station in our diverging lives, once again became a sanctuary, a shared home. He threw himself into work, a familiar refuge for him. But when he came home, the confident armor he wore for the outside world was gone. He was quieter, more introspective, more vulnerable than I had ever known him to be. And he sought my company with a new, quiet urgency. It was no longer just the comfortable coexistence of roommates. It was something meatier, something that felt like a reaching out in the dark. Our movie nights became a regular fixture, a silent agreement that this was how we would spend our evenings. We'd order takeout and sit on the couch, the same way we had 1,000 times before. But the geography of the couch began to change. The continent of space between us started to shrink. It began with him falling asleep. He would be fighting it, his head nodding, his body slumping, until finally, with a soft sigh of surrender, his head would come to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact, the weight of his head, the soft tickle of his hair against my neck, the warmth seeping through the fabric of my shirt. I sat there for the entire 2-hour film, my muscles aching from the stillness, my heart pounding a frantic, silent rhythm against my ribs. I studied the side of his face, the relaxed line of his mouth, the faint stubble on his jaw. It was an intimacy so profound, so far beyond the boundaries I had set for myself, that it felt like I was breaking a sacred rule. When the movie ended, I didn't know what to do. Waking him felt cruel. Leaving him there seemed wrong. After a long, internal debate, I gently shifted my weight, trying to ease him onto a cushion. He stirred, murmuring something incoherent, and then settled back against me, his arms snaking around my waist, pulling himself closer in his sleep. My breath hitched. This was new territory. This was a place for which I had no map. I was a cartographer of light and shadow, not the complex, uncharted terrain of this new, ambiguous affection. I eventually fell asleep like that, sitting upright, with him tucked against my side, my mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. Hope that this meant something. Fear that it meant nothing at all, that I was just a convenient, warm body, a substitute for the comfort he had lost. This became our ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would fall asleep on me, and I would let him. I learned the specific weight and warmth of him. I learned the pattern of his breathing as he slipped from drowsiness into deep sleep. I began to photograph him in my mind, composing these quiet portraits of vulnerability. The way a stray beam of light from the street lamp outside would catch the curve of his ear. The way his hand would be loosely curled on his chest. I was still the observer, but the distance was gone. I was part of the composition now, no longer safely behind the lens. Each time it happened, I would analyze it, searching for meaning. Was this a subconscious act? A deliberate choice masked by the plausible deniability of sleep? I became a detective of subtle gestures, a scholar of unspoken things. The ritual escalated. One night, after he woke up on the couch with a stiff neck, he stood, stretched, and looked at me with a tired, sheepish grin. "My back is killing me," he said. "Your couch is a torture device," he paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Hey, is it cool if I just crash in the spare room tonight? My bed feels, I don't know, big." The spare room was mostly my storage space, filled with photography props and boxes of old prints, but there was a small, simple bed in there for guests. Of course I said yes. It was a perfectly reasonable request. And yet, it felt like another shift, another tectonic plate moving beneath our feet. He started sleeping in the spare room more often than not, and I noticed something that sent my analytical mind into overdrive. He always left the door ajar, not wide open, but cracked just enough to let a sliver of light from the hallway bleed into the darkness. That open door became a symbol, a question mark hanging in the silent air of our apartment at night. Why leave it open? Was it for the light? Was it a forgotten detail? Or was it an invitation? A signal? I would lie awake in my own bed, just down the hall, and stare at the ceiling, my imagination running wild. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing, the rustle of sheets as he shifted in his sleep. The open door was a liminal space, a threshold between friendship and something else, and we were both hovering there, not daring to cross. It was a state of exquisite tension. My life had become a study in proximity. The millimeters of space between his head and my shoulder. The few feet of hallway separating our beds. The single, unlocked, open door. I was living in the spaces between things, in the pauses between beats, in the held breath before a word is spoken. Then came the storm. It was a late autumn squall that blew in with a furious, rattling intensity. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the apartment into a sudden, profound darkness and silence, broken only by the roar of the storm outside. We had been reading in the living room, me with a book on photographic theory, him with a dense business report. The sudden blackness was disorienting. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight cutting a sharp, lonely beam through the dark. Julian was just a silhouette across the room. "Well," he said, his voice sounding oddly close in the smothering dark. "This is cozy. We found candles and lit them, scattering them around the living room." The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar space feel strange and intimate, like a secret cave. We talked for hours, the storm providing a dramatic soundtrack. We talked about things we hadn't discussed in years. Childhood memories, old dreams, forgotten fears. The darkness seemed to strip away our usual defenses, leaving us with a raw, simple honesty. It felt like the darkroom all over again, a place outside of time where only the essential things were real. At some point, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed a shutter somewhere outside, and the sound was like a gunshot. Julian flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement. I saw it clearly in the candlelight. For all his daytime confidence, I knew he had never liked thunderstorms. Later, when the storm had softened to a steady, drumming rain and it was time for bed, he hesitated. He stood by the entrance to the hallway, his silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight. "Leo," he started, his voice low. He stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Never mind. It's stupid, what is it?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was anxious. "It's just the storm. And the dark. My room feels, I don't know, isolated." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. The vulnerability in that look was a physical blow. Would it be weird if I... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The question hung in the air between us, as loud as the thunder had been. The open door was no longer enough. He needed to close the distance completely. My mind raced, a frantic catalog of all the reasons this was a terrible idea, a dangerous line to cross. But my heart, that foolish, hopeful traitor, had already made its decision. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It wouldn't be weird." I saw the relief wash over his face, a visible loosening of the tension in his shoulders. He followed me down the hall to my room. The space felt charged, electric. I was intensely aware of everything. the soft pad of his socked feet on the hardwood floor behind me, the way he stood uncertainly by the door as I pulled back the covers on my bed. It was a queen-sized bed, but in that moment, it felt as small as a lifeboat. I got in on my usual side, leaving a wide, deliberate space for him. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a sleeping animal. He slid under the covers and lay on his back, his body a rigid line, a careful foot of space between us. For a long time, we lay there in silence, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, the only sound the rain on the roof and the frantic drumming of my own pulse in my ears. The air was thick with unspoken things. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gap between us. It was a tangible presence, a force field of warmth and longing. I wanted to roll over, to close that gap, to feel the solid reality of him against me. But I was paralyzed by the fear of misinterpretation, of shattering this fragile, beautiful, terrifying thing we were building. I was the observer. I did not act. I only watched and waited. "Leo," he whispered into the darkness. His voice was so quiet it was almost part of the rain. "Yeah," I whispered back, my throat dry. He was silent for another long moment. I could hear him take a slow, deep breath. "Thanks," he said. "For not thinking it's weird, it's not weird," I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. And in that moment, it wasn't. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, the logical conclusion to a journey we had been on for months. He shifted slightly, the sound of the sheets rustling in the quiet room. He rolled onto his side, facing me. I couldn't see his expression in the dark, but I could feel his gaze on me. The space between us hummed with a palpable energy. This, I thought, is the moment before the photograph is taken. The moment of perfect, unbearable stillness before the click of the shutter. The moment that holds all the potential of what is to come. And so we lay there, suspended in that perfect, fragile moment, on the precipice of a country whose name I did not yet know. This, too, became a ritual, the final and most intimate evolution of our new normal. The storm passed, but the pretext remained, unspoken but mutually understood. It was colder now. The apartment was drafty. He had a bad dream. He was just too tired to walk down the hall. The excuses were flimsy, transparent veils over a need that was becoming more and more apparent. Nearly every night, he would end up in my bed. We established a silent choreography. He would take the right side, I the left. We would lie on our backs, a careful demilitarized zone of cotton sheet between us. But as the nights passed, the zone began to shrink. A foot would brush against another's. A hand, in sleep, would find its way across the divide. Each accidental touch was a spark in the dark, a silent question and answer. I lived for the nights and dreaded the mornings. At night, in the quiet darkness, we existed in this liminal space where we were more than friends, but less than lovers. The rules of the daytime world did not apply. In the dark, all that existed was the profound comfort of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me, a human metronome that soothed the frantic tempo of my own heart. I would often lie awake long after he had fallen asleep, just listening, just being near him. It was a form of nourishment I hadn't known I was starving for. But in the morning, the light would come, and with it, the rules would return. We would wake up, carefully untangling ourselves, studiously avoiding each other's eyes. We would pretend that the intimacy of the night had been a dream, a temporary truce in the normal order of things. We would make coffee, talk about work, and perform the familiar roles of friends and roommates, the memory of the shared warmth a secret, pulsing thing beneath the surface of our conversation. The tension was building to a breaking point. It was a high-wire act, and we couldn't maintain our balance forever. The unspoken was becoming a living entity in the apartment, a third roommate that sat with us at the dinner table and watched movies with us from the space on the couch. It was in the lingering glances, the half-finished sentences, the charged silence that fell between us in the quiet moments. And it was during one of those quiet moments, on a Tuesday night in late October, with the rain misting against the windows, that the wire finally snapped. We were on the couch, a movie playing, but neither of us was watching. The space between us felt vast and empty. The easy physicality of our past and the ambiguous intimacy of our present had somehow canceled each other out, leaving us in this strange, formal distance. It was then that he turned to me, his face serious in the flickering light from the screen, and spoke the 6 words that would become the hinges on which my life would turn. "I miss how close we used to be," he said. His voice was quiet, laced with a melancholy I couldn't decipher. He was talking about the past, about the time before Amelia, before the breakup, before our nights of shared, silent intimacy. He was talking about the easy, uncomplicated friendship we had. But then he looked at me, and the look in his eyes was not about the past. It was about the present. It was a look that acknowledged the chasm that had opened up between us on this couch, even as we were closer than ever in the darkness of my bedroom. It was a look of profound, undisguised longing. He looked at me like he wanted it back, not the friendship we had, but the closeness he was only just beginning to understand. He looked at me like I held the key to a door he was afraid to open himself. My breath caught in my throat. The world seemed to slow down, the sound from the television fading into a distant hum. All I could see was his face, his eyes searching mine for an answer to a question he hadn't spoken aloud. The observer in me, the part that had spent a decade documenting my love for him from a safe distance, was screaming to look away, to make a joke, to shatter the intensity of the moment and retreat to the safety of the known. But another part of me, a part that had been silent for too long, knew that this was it. This was the threshold. The door was right in front of me, and all I had to do was reach out and turn the handle. I did not speak. I did not move. I simply held his gaze, and for the first time, I let him see it. I took down the walls. I dismantled the fortifications. I let him see the decade of quiet, patient love I had kept hidden there. I let him see the hope and the fear and the agonizing uncertainty of the past few months. I let him see all of it. I gave him the truth in a single, sustained look. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, of recognition. The air between us crackled, a live wire of sudden, terrifying, beautiful understanding. He started to lean in, his movement slow, hesitant, a question in physical form. And I met him halfway. The kiss was not what I had imagined. In my years of secret fantasies, it had been 100 different things, passionate, desperate, gentle, surprising. But it was none of those. It was a moment of quiet, profound recognition. It was soft, tentative, a gentle press of lips that felt more like a confession than a kiss. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you didn't know you had been searching for. It tasted of salt and longing and the rain on the window pane. It was a question and an answer and a prayer all at once. We stayed like that for a moment that stretched into an eternity, a perfect, still frame in the chaotic movie of my life. When we pulled away, the space between us was no longer a chasm. It was a sanctuary. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. He rested his forehead against mine, and I felt him release a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. In the silence, I could hear the click of the latch as the door swung shut behind us. We were in a new room now. The light was different, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we would never be the same. The morning after was a study in silence. But it was not the comfortable, companionable silence we had once shared, nor the charged, anticipatory silence of the past few months. It was a new kind of quiet, thin and brittle, like a sheet of ice stretched over a deep, dark body of water. I woke up first, a habit ingrained from years of early morning swim practices. The space beside me in the bed was empty, but the indentation on the pillow and the faint, lingering warmth told me he had only just left. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed for work, staring into a mug of coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. He didn't look up when I came in. The easy rhythm of our morning routine was gone, replaced by a stilted, awkward choreography. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Morning," he replied, his gaze still fixed on his mug. He took a quick sip, then set it down with a sharp clink against the granite countertop. "I have an early meeting. I should go." He moved towards the door, grabbing his briefcase from the chair where he'd left it. He didn't look at me. He was a fortress, all his walls back up, higher and thicker than ever before. He was avoiding my eyes, avoiding the space we were in, avoiding the memory of the night before, as if it were a contagious disease. "Julian," I said, my voice stopping him at the door. He paused, his back still to me. "Are we okay?" He was silent for a long moment. I watched the tense line of his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and distant. "I'm just late," he said. And then he was gone, the front door closing with a soft, definitive click that echoed the sound I had imagined in my head the night before. But this click was not one of arrival. It was one of departure. I stood alone in the kitchen, the scent of his coffee hanging in the air like a ghost. The new room we had entered felt suddenly cold and empty. The beautiful, honest silence had been replaced by a gaping, painful void. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Julian became a phantom in our own apartment. He left before I woke up and came home long after I had gone to bed. When we did cross paths, in the hallway or the kitchen, the encounters were brief and strained. He was polite, distant, his conversation limited to logistical necessities. "We're out of milk, did the mail come?" He was treating me like a stranger, a polite but unfamiliar roommate. The open door to the spare room was now firmly shut. My bed was once again my own, but the space beside me felt cavernous and cold. The ritual was broken. The intimacy we had built so carefully, so tentatively, had vanished as if it had never existed. My mind became a torture chamber of self-doubt. I replayed the kiss, the look, the conversation over and over again, analyzing every frame, every nuance. Had I imagined it all? Had I misinterpreted a moment of grief-fueled confusion as something more? Had my own longing projected a meaning onto his actions that was never there? I had been the quiet observer for so long, confident in my ability to read the subtle language of the world around me. But now, I felt like I was reading a book in a language I didn't understand. The fear that I had ruined the most important relationship in my life was a physical ache in my chest, a constant, dull pressure beneath my ribs. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It was a silence full of unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. And I knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that I couldn't live inside it anymore. My passivity, my observer's stance, had brought me to this point, but it couldn't get me through it. For the first time, I had to be the one to act. I had to force the issue. I had to demand the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. I waited for him. It was a Saturday night, a week after the kiss. I knew he couldn't avoid me forever. I sat on the couch, the television off, the room lit only by a single lamp, creating a pool of soft, interrogative light. I felt like a character in a noir film, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. When he finally came home, just after 10, he stopped short in the doorway when he saw me, his surprise evident. He was clearly expecting an empty, dark apartment. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "You're up, we need to talk," I said. There was no preamble, no gentle easing into it. The words were flat and heavy, and they landed in the space between us with undeniable force. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and dropped his keys on the entryway table. He didn't move to take off his coat. He stood there, framed in the doorway, a man trapped on a threshold he didn't want to cross. "Leo, I'm really tired," he said, the classic avoidance tactic. "I don't care," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to kiss me and then pretend I don't exist. You don't get to turn our home into a minefield of awkward silences. I deserve more than that. Our friendship deserves more than that." The words poured out of me, a torrent of frustration and hurt that had been building for days. He finally looked at me then, and I saw not anger or annoyance, but a deep, profound exhaustion. He looked lost. He walked slowly into the room and sank into the armchair opposite me, running a hand over his face. "I know," he said, his voice muffled by his hand. "You're right. I'm sorry. I've been a coward." He dropped his hand and looked at me, his eyes full of a conflict that was painful to watch. I don't know what's happening, Leo. Everything is a mess." "What do you mean you don't know?" I asked, my frustration rising again. "You kissed me, Julian. That's not a mess. That's an action. It meant something. It had to mean something. Of course it meant something," he said, his voice rising in volume for the first time. "You think I go around kissing my best friend for no reason? I panicked. The next morning, I woke up, and it was real, in the daylight, and I freaked out. Why?" I asked, the single word a plea for understanding. "Why would you panic?" He stood up and began to pace the small space between the couch and the chair, a caged animal. "Because you're you," he exclaimed, gesturing at me as if I were the source of all his confusion. "You're Leo? You're my best friend. You're the one stable thing in my entire life. The one person who has always been there, no questions asked. And I took that, and I twisted it into something complicated, something I could break. What if I'm just lonely? What if I'm just rebounding from Amelia, and I'm using you for comfort? What if I ruin the best thing I've ever had because I'm too messed up to know what I actually want? His voice cracked on the last sentence, and he stopped pacing, turning to face the window, his back to me. His words were a series of gut punches. He was voicing every single one of my own worst fears. That I was a port in a storm, a convenient comfort, a placeholder. The observer in me wanted to retreat, to analyze his pain from a safe distance. But I was done observing. I stood up and walked over to him, stopping just behind him. I could see his reflection in the dark glass of the window, his face a mask of turmoil. "Look at me, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He didn't move. "Please," slowly, he turned around. His eyes were glistening. "Do you think I'm that fragile?" I asked. "Do you think our friendship is so weak that a single moment of honesty could destroy it? For 10 years, I have been your friend. I was your friend when you were a cocky college kid who couldn't load a roll of film. I was your friend when you were celebrating your successes, and I was your friend when Amelia broke your heart. Nothing you feel, no confusion or fear you have, could ever be enough to break that." I took a breath, preparing to step off the final cliff. "I love you, Julian. I have been in love with you for years." That kiss wasn't the start of something for me. It was just the first time the feeling was allowed to have a voice. So whatever you're feeling, whether it's real or just a temporary confusion, it doesn't change the foundation. But you have to stop running. You have to talk to me. The confession hung in the air between us, a final, irrevocable truth. His face crumpled, the carefully constructed walls of his composure turning to dust. He stepped forward, closing the small gap between us, and buried his face in my shoulder. I felt his body shake with a silent, racking sob. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly, my own eyes burning. He wasn't crying for Amelia, or for his broken engagement. He was crying for his own confusion, for his fear, for the relief of finally being seen. We stood like that for a long time, in the center of our living room, two broken, terrified people holding each other together. There were no easy answers in that moment, no magical resolution. But for the first time in a week, there was no silence. There was only the raw, painful, beautiful truth. In the aftermath of the storm, there is a profound and quiet stillness. The air is washed clean, and the world seems to take its first, tentative breath. That's what the days following our confrontation felt like. The tense, brittle silence was gone, replaced by a soft, careful quiet. We began to talk. Really talk. Not about logistics or work, but about us. We sat on the couch, this time with no movie to distract us, and he told me everything. He spoke of the slow dawning realization that his feelings for me were not just platonic. He admitted that the comfort he sought from me after his breakup was different, deeper than just friendship. He confessed that the ritual of sleeping in my bed had started as a genuine need for comfort, but had morphed into something he looked forward to with a confusing mixture of longing and guilt. He was a man who built his life on certainty and clear strategies, and the ambiguity of his own heart had terrified him. He had panicked because for the first time, he was facing a problem he couldn't solve with a spreadsheet or a 5-point plan. I listened, and I understood. I, who had lived my life in the gray areas of unspoken feelings, understood his fear of them. We were two sides of the same coin. He, who ran from ambiguity, and I, who had made a home in it. We talked for hours, over days. We untangled the last decade, laying out all the unspoken moments, all the near misses, all the misinterpreted signals. It was like developing an old roll of film. The images were faint at first, but with care and the right chemistry, the picture became clearer, sharper. We were not just friends. We had not been for a very long time. We had simply been afraid to name what we were. Slowly, tentatively, we began to build something new. It was a delicate process, like learning a new language. The first time he reached for my hand, we were walking to the grocery store. It was a simple, public gesture, but it felt monumental. His hand was warm and solid in mine, a comforting, tangible anchor. There was no pretext, no plausible deniability. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. This is me. This is you. This is us. We started to relearn the geography of our apartment. The couch was no longer a space of formal distance or sleepy. accidental intimacy. It was a place where he would pull my legs into his lap while he read, his hand resting absently on my ankle. The kitchen was where we learned to move around each other in a new dance, a comfortable ballet of domesticity, my hand finding the small of his back, not as a casual gesture of navigation, but as a quiet affirmation of presence. My bedroom door was now closed at night. There was no need for an open door, no need for an invitation or an excuse. It was a shared space, our space. The demilitarized zone in the bed disappeared, replaced by a landscape of warmth and closeness. To fall asleep with his arm around my waist, his steady breathing a gentle rhythm against my back, was a form of peace I had never imagined possible. The quiet, observant part of me hadn't vanished. It had simply changed its focus. I still watched him, still cataloged the little details of his existence. But now, my observations were not tinged with the melancholy of unrequited love. They were filled with the quiet joy of shared intimacy. I photographed the way the morning light hit the pillow next to me after he'd gotten up, the two coffee mugs sitting side by side on the counter, the comfortable mess of our shoes by the front door. These were the quiet, beautiful images of our new life, a life I was no longer just documenting from the outside. I was in the frame now, and it was a masterpiece. There are moments in your life that function like doors. For years, I had stood before one, my hand hovering over the handle, terrified of what lay on the other side. I was afraid of destroying the world I knew, the safe and predictable room of our friendship. But what I never understood was that the room I was so afraid of leaving was, in its own way, a prison. A beautiful, comfortable prison, but a prison nonetheless. It was Julian, in his own fear and confusion, who finally forced the door open. He stumbled through it, and in my fear of losing him, I found the courage to follow. And the new room we found ourselves in was not a place of ruin and collapse. It was a place filled with a light I had never seen before, a place where the air was easier to breathe. It was a place where we began to heal, not just from our recent wounds, but from the old, quiet aches of loneliness we had both been carrying for years. It was the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. It was home.